91%. That's how many Japanese carrier crewmen never came home. The Empire built the most elite naval air force the world had ever seen. Yet by 1945, almost every man was dead, every ship sunk. How does the strongest fleet in the Pacific become a floating graveyard in just 3 years? The answer is darker and more shocking than you've ever been told. 91%. That was the death rate of Japanese carrier crews by the final summer of World War II. The Pacific was littered with steel skeletons, once proud carriers now resting on the ocean floor, their twisted hulls filled with the ghosts of thousands. For every 100 men who had served aboard those floating fortresses, only 9 ever saw their homeland again. The rest were consumed by fire, by smoke, by the black waters that closed over burning decks. Imagine the scene: a carrier struck by a single bomb, flames racing through hangars crammed with planes already fueled, already armed. The blast rips open the ship's heart. Aviation fuel turns corridors into rivers of fire. Men leap into the sea, only to find the water itself ablaze. Their screams fade beneath the crackle of burning steel. These were not accidents. They were the result of choices. Choices made in doctrine, in design, in blind faith that spirit could overcome reality. Japan had begun the war with the finest carrier force on Earth. Pilots trained for years, crews drilled to perfection. Yet by 1945, those same ships had become floating coffins. The arithmetic was merciless. 4 carriers lost at Midway, 3 more at the Philippine Sea. Hundreds of aircraft gone in minutes, thousands of trained men erased in hours. And behind each loss, an empire unwilling or unable to adapt. This is the untold story of how the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier arm, once the sharpest blade of the Pacific War, destroyed itself from within. But to understand why so few survived, why an entire naval culture perished beneath waves and fire, we must return to the beginning. In the years before the Pacific exploded into war, the sea was already changing. Battleships had once ruled as the undisputed giants, their massive guns seen as the final word in naval power. Yet in the shadows of treaties and secret shipyards, another weapon was rising: the aircraft carrier. Japan watched this shift with obsessive focus. Bound by the Washington and London naval treaties, the Imperial Navy was forced to limit battleship construction. But carriers slipped through loopholes. In the minds of Japanese strategists, here lay the path to supremacy. Instead of matching America gun for gun, they would strike from the sky. The doctrine that shaped their thinking was Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. A single cataclysmic clash would determine control of the Pacific. Carriers became the sword to deliver that blow. They would sail far ahead, launch waves of aircraft, and cripple the enemy fleet before battleships ever fired a round. To achieve this vision, Japan poured its brightest minds and boldest resources into carriers like Akagi and Kaga. These ships were more than machines of war. They were symbols of a nation clawing for respect, a nation determined to break free from Western dominance. Propaganda films showed them as floating cities, gleaming with pride, unstoppable in their grace. But beneath the polished steel was a dangerous assumption. Japan's naval leaders believed spirit outweighed material weakness. If their sailors carried the fire of Bushido, if their pilots embraced the willingness to die, then victory was assured. Training was grueling. Pilots logged hundreds of hours, drilled until flying became instinct. Crews were taught discipline, loyalty, and the unshakable belief that survival was secondary to success. In those early years, the doctrine seemed invincible. Carrier task forces swept through Asia with speed and precision. Pearl Harbor's devastation in December 1941 appeared to prove their vision correct. 6 carriers launched more than 350 aircraft in a single morning, and in just 2 hours, the U.S. Pacific Fleet lay burning. Yet hidden inside that triumph were fatal cracks. While America rotated its pilots, sending veterans home to train new squadrons, Japan kept its aces on the front line until they were killed. While the U.S. built schools dedicated to damage control, Japan glorified sacrifice, leaving firefighting to buckets and faith. The arithmetic was already stacked against them. America's industry dwarfed Japan's, capable of producing carriers, planes, and men at a rate no island empire could match. Japan gambled that a decisive blow would end the war before that imbalance mattered. What they did not see, or refused to admit, was that war had become a contest of endurance, not just spirit. Every carrier lost would be nearly impossible to replace. Every veteran pilot killed would leave a hole no classroom could quickly fill. Thus, as the Pacific widened into flames, the Japanese carrier force entered battle with doctrine carved in pride, not in practicality. They sailed into the storm armed with faith in Bushido and the dream of Kantai Kessen, believing their strength lay in willpower alone. But the ocean doesn't bend to spirit. The ocean listens only to numbers, to steel, to fire. And soon, the carriers that embodied Japan's grand vision would reveal themselves as fragile monuments, destined to burn, destined to sink, destined to take almost every man aboard with them. The carriers of Japan were not born overnight. They emerged from a blend of treaty restrictions, national ambition, and technical daring. Each hull carried the weight of a nation determined to prove itself on the world stage. It began with conversions. The great battleship hull Akagi and the unfinished Tosa-class hull Kaga were reshaped into carriers in the 1920s. Their towering profiles and vast flight decks looked alien to traditional admirals. Yet they carried the promise of a new kind of war. These ships became laboratories, testing elevators, hangars, and arrestor gear, crafting the blueprint for a fleet that would soon dominate the Pacific. Through the 1930s, as clouds of conflict gathered over Asia, the Imperial Navy expanded this vision. Shōkaku and Zuikaku were laid down as purpose-built carriers, sleek and modern, their decks stretching like runways of steel across the sea. They were called the Crane Sisters, graceful yet lethal. Each could carry over 80 aircraft, each one bristling with the pride of Japanese engineering. Inside these floating fortresses, another revolution was taking place, the forging of the world's most elite naval aviators. Training was merciless. Candidates were pushed through 800 hours of flight before being declared combat ready. They practiced takeoffs and landings until muscles obeyed without thought, until terror gave way to precision. The cost was staggering. More than half of those who entered training never reached the cockpit of a carrier plane. But those who did became legends before they ever saw a battle. To fly for the Imperial Navy was not merely a career, it was a calling, a badge of honor that carried the expectation of sacrifice. The Japanese people celebrated these men as heroes. Newspapers printed their photographs, depicting them as modern samurai, guardians of the empire's destiny. Propaganda films showed carriers slicing through the Pacific with aircraft roaring overhead, an image meant to stir both fear and pride. To many citizens, these ships seemed invincible, steel dragons carrying warriors of the sky. Beneath the surface, however, technical flaws simmered. Hangars were designed to cram in as many planes as possible. Aviation fuel systems were extensive, but dangerously exposed. Damage control equipment was minimal. Yet these vulnerabilities were dismissed. The emphasis was on offensive power, not defense. Spirit would make up the difference, at least so the admirals believed. Still, in the early days, the fleet glittered with promise. By 1941, Japan possessed 10 fleet carriers, more than any other nation. Together they formed the first air fleet, Kido Butai, the most powerful concentration of naval aviation the world had ever seen. To the outside observer, it seemed unbreakable. Sailors who walked the decks of a Kagi or Kaga spoke of awe, the endless rows of Zero fighters gleaming beneath the sun, the smell of fuel and oil mixed with the salt spray of the Pacific, the thunder of engines reverberating through steel decks. For the young men who served there, these carriers felt like cities of destiny, alive, invulnerable, eternal. And yet, within this creation lay its curse. Every resource had been poured into the blade, but none into the shield. The men were trained to kill, not to survive. The ships were designed to strike, not to endure. It was a force of brilliance balanced on a razor's edge. As the Empire prepared for its greatest gamble, the carrier fleet stood ready, a weapon born of treaties, perfected through sacrifice, and elevated into legend by the faith of a nation. Their bows pointed east across the Pacific, toward an enemy that had not yet awakened to their fury. Soon, these floating fortresses would unleash destruction on a scale the world had never seen. But within their very design, within the very system that forged them, the seeds of tragedy were already sown. The first air fleet sailed into history like a predator gliding through dark waters. 6 carriers at its core, hundreds of aircraft lashed to their decks, thousands of men drilled into silent efficiency. In the closing months of 1941, these ships carried not only weapons, but the weight of an empire's ambition. For the sailors aboard, life was a paradox. The routine was endless: cleaning decks, polishing brass, checking lines, inspecting aircraft again and again. Yet beneath the monotony beat a pulse of anticipation. Everyone knew something was coming. The Empire was moving toward war. Orders were whispered, sealed in envelopes. Maps were studied in secret rooms. But the destination was hidden even from many of the men who would soon fly into the storm. When the fleet left Hitokapu Bay in November, the air was thick with frost. The carriers steamed north into desolate seas, hiding in the cloak of winter. Pilots passed the time in their cramped quarters, rereading letters from home, gambling with dice, or gazing at the gray horizon. Some joked nervously. Others prayed. The young believed in glory. The veterans sensed a reckoning. Then, on December 7th, the silence broke. Dawn over Pearl Harbor. Waves of aircraft lifted from Japanese decks, engines shrieking like steel hawks. They swept down upon the unsuspecting U.S. fleet. Battleships erupted in fire. Airfields were shattered. The Pacific trembled. The men aboard carriers like Akagi and Kaga felt invincible. Their gamble had worked. The enemy was crippled before it could rise. They celebrated in the mess halls, toasting with tea, voices swelling with triumph. For a moment, the dream of Kantai Kaisen, the decisive battle, seemed within reach. The months that followed carried them across vast arcs of ocean. Raids on the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Ceylon. Each victory widened the Empire's shadow. Sailors wrote home with pride. Mothers and fathers read newspapers declaring Japan's unstoppable advance. The carriers were no longer experiments. They were the beating heart of conquest. Yet even in triumph, cracks appeared. Aircraft lost in combat were replaced slowly. Experienced pilots, the veterans of China and Pearl Harbor, continued to fly every mission. None were rotated home. None trained new cadets. Every sortie burned away irreplaceable skill. The young men joining the squadrons had fewer hours, less confidence, less mastery. But in those early victories, few dared to notice. Life aboard the carriers carried on with rituals of discipline. Morning assemblies echoed with commands. Planes were wheeled onto decks, their wings unfolding like predatory birds. Crews handled bombs and torpedoes with steady hands. Below, engineers coaxed boilers and turbines to life, filling corridors with the hum of machinery. At night, lanterns were dimmed. Only starlight glimmered on steel. The sea was endless. The war felt unstoppable. Still, whispers spread among the men. Some recalled how close the raids had come to disaster. A torpedo jammed. A bomb failed to detonate. A handful of American fighters had fought with unexpected ferocity. Veterans who had studied the United States knew its industry was immense. They warned, every battle won today might bring a stronger foe tomorrow. But official speeches drowned out such doubts. Officers reminded crews that spirit was greater than steel. Sacrifice was the measure of victory. Bushido would shield them where armor could not. The men cheered, though in their hearts some wondered how long faith alone could hold against machines, against numbers. By the spring of 1942, the carriers sailed again. Their mission? To lure the U.S. Pacific Fleet into the open sea and destroy it in one stroke. The trap would be set near a tiny atoll called Midway. The men prepared as they always had, checking engines, fueling aircraft, arming bombs. Yet few realized they were steaming not toward triumph, but toward disaster. For now, though, in those quiet days before the storm, the carriers seemed eternal. The cranes of Zuikaku and Shōkaku, the steel decks of Akagi and Kaga, the endless hum of planes waiting to launch. To the men who walked those decks, destiny felt close enough to touch. They did not know that the same ocean carrying them to glory was also carrying them into fire, into smoke, into the abyss from which almost none would return. The sea was calm on the morning of June 4th, 1942. To the Japanese carriers gathered near Midway, it seemed another routine day of preparation. Planes were armed in hangars. Crews bustled with the efficiency of long practice. The horizon was empty. The officers believed the enemy was far away, unsuspecting, too weak to strike back. But the silence hid a storm. Far above, American scout planes had already spotted them. Invisible eyes were watching, stalking, waiting for the right moment to descend. The attack came just after 10 in the morning. From the sun, out of blinding light, American dive bombers plummeted. Sirens wailed as lookouts screamed warnings. Men on deck turned their faces upward. Too late. The first bomb pierced through Akagi's flight deck. Then another tore into Kaga. In minutes, the calm blue sea was filled with smoke and flame. On Kaga, the blast reached a hangar stuffed with fueled aircraft. One detonation triggered 20 more. The chain reaction raced through the ship like fire through dry grass. Explosions thundered beneath the deck. Steel buckled. Men ran choking through black smoke, some throwing themselves into the sea only to find the water burning with fuel. 700 perished in less than 10 minutes. Akagi was struck by a single bomb that cut deep into the hangar. Fires spread with terrifying speed. Flames roared through passages, devouring men, paint, oxygen. Admiral Nagumo was forced to abandon his flagship as the inferno consumed it. Soryu was hit by 3 bombs. In 20 minutes, she was a skeleton of fire. Hundreds of sailors died screaming in the furnace below deck. Shōkaku's sister ship, Hiryu, struck back, launching desperate counterattacks. Her pilots hit Yorktown, crippling the American carrier. But vengeance was short-lived. By late afternoon, dive bombers found Hiryu and struck with lethal precision. Fires spread uncontrollably. Her crew fought for hours, but by nightfall the order was given to abandon ship. In a single day, 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were lost. More than 3,000 men vanished into smoke and ocean. What was meant to be a decisive victory had become a decisive catastrophe. The survivors remembered the horror not in strategy, but in senses. The roar of engines drowned by the roar of fire, the searing heat of steel beneath their boots, the sight of comrades engulfed in flames, running blindly before collapsing. One sailor later said the hangar was not a deck, but a crematorium. The Battle of Midway was not just the loss of ships, it was the loss of Japan's irreplaceable core of veteran pilots, men who had trained for years, who had mastered the art of carrier warfare, were cut down in hours. America could build new ships, new planes, new men. Japan could not. The scale of the defeat was invisible at first, but its shadow stretched across the rest of the war. Yet the tragedy deepened. 2 years later, the carriers returned to battle at the Philippine Sea. This time the imbalance was even greater. American radar-guided anti-aircraft guns spat fire with deadly accuracy. American pilots had 300 hours of training before combat. Japanese rookies had 30. Some had never landed on a carrier in calm seas, yet now they were asked to fight and die. On June 19, 1944, waves of Japanese aircraft launched from Zuikaku, Shōkaku, and Taihō. They flew into a wall of steel. American fighters tore through them. Bombers disintegrated in mid-air. Torpedo planes fell into the sea without ever reaching their targets. The sky became a slaughterhouse. From the decks of U.S. carriers, it seemed less a battle than an execution. Pilots spoke of enemy formations shattering like glass under hammer blows. By nightfall, Japan had lost nearly 400 aircraft and almost every pilot who flew them. American losses were 29 planes. The kill ratio was 13-1. History called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For the men in the cockpits, it was a massacre. On the carrier Taihō, a single torpedo from a submarine punched into her hull. The damage at first seemed survivable, but ventilation systems spread gasoline fumes through the ship. 6 hours later, a spark ignited them. The carrier erupted in a single shattering explosion. 27,000 tons of steel became a burning coffin for more than 1,000 men. Shōkaku followed soon after, struck by multiple torpedoes. She sank quickly, dragging 1,200 sailors with her into the deep. Survivors described the sea itself catching fire, men thrashing in waves coated with burning fuel, their cries silenced by smoke. With each sinking, the Japanese carrier force bled not just steel, but spirit. Crews began to understand that survival wasn't part of their mission profile. By 1945, carriers were no longer instruments of battle, but launch pads for kamikaze. Planes left the decks with no intention of returning. Sailors knew they were escorting young men to one-way deaths, and that their own fate would be no different. At Okinawa, carriers like Amagi and Katsuragi sat in harbors waiting for aircraft that never arrived. American bombers reduced them to wrecks at anchor. Crews died at their posts, surrounded by the silence of defeat. The climax of Japan's carrier story was not one moment, but a chain of calamities. Midway shattered the elite. The Philippine Sea annihilated the replacements. Each disaster carved deeper into flesh and soul, until nothing remained but hollow steel and empty decks. By the end, only Zuikaku still sailed. She fought her final action at Leyte Gulf, a decoy meant to lure American forces away. Surrounded, battered by bombs and torpedoes, she rolled onto her side and sank, taking more than 1,000 men with her. The rising sun flag slipped beneath the waves, never to return. Thus ended the mightiest carrier fleet Japan had ever assembled. Not in the blaze of decisive victory, but in scattered infernos, drowning screams, and the slow realization that spirit alone cannot fight mathematics. The decisive tragedy of the Japanese carrier force was not that they were destroyed. It was that they were destroyed in exactly the way their own doctrine had ordained, fighting to the last man, never admitting defeat, burning until nothing was left but smoke, ocean, and silence. The collapse of Japan's carrier fleet did not arrive in a single thunderclap. It came in waves, each one heavier than the last, until nothing remained but wreckage and ghosts. After Midway, the Empire still possessed carriers. They still carried aircraft. They still sent men into battle. But the heart of the force was gone. The veterans who had flown at Pearl Harbor, the masters of deck landings and aerial combat, were dead. Their replacements were boys with barely 30 hours in the air. Some had trained in gliders to save fuel. Many had never once landed on a moving carrier before being thrown into combat. The arithmetic was impossible to ignore. America produced 2,500 pilots every month. Japan produced 200. Every new clash meant another deficit of skill, another graveyard of wasted youth. The ships themselves revealed their fatal flaws again and again. Taihō, newest and largest, was lost to a single torpedo because her crew did not know to seal ventilation. Gasoline vapors turned her into a bomb. Shōkaku perished the same day, her decks torn apart by fire, her crew swallowed by an ocean slick with burning fuel. In November 1944, the pride of the fleet, Shinano, sailed from Yokosuka on her maiden voyage. 72,000 tons of steel, the largest carrier the world had yet seen. Within 24 hours, she was gone. Struck by 4 torpedoes from an American submarine, she should have survived. Instead, her untrained crew failed to close watertight doors. Pumps lay idle. Damage control equipment went unused. By sunrise, Shinano rolled and slipped beneath the waves, taking 1,400 men with her. For the sailors who survived these disasters, disillusion was complete. They had been taught that spirit could overcome material weakness. Yet every fire, every explosion, every sinking proved the opposite. Spirit burned away with the flesh of their comrades. What remained was silence, smoke, and the endless sea. By 1945, the final carriers were reduced to shadows. Many were converted cruisers or unfinished hulls pressed into desperate service. Their decks launched aircraft not for battle, but for one-way suicide missions. Kamikaze pilots roared into the sky, saluted by crews who knew they would never see them return. The carriers themselves became waiting rooms for death. When the Amagi was attacked at Cure Harbor, she never even left her moorings. Bombs rained down, tearing her apart as her crew waited helplessly below decks. Survivors crawled from wreckage only to see their ship capsize at anchor, a symbol of defeat so stark that even Japan's censors could not hide it. The immediate consequences were devastating. Entire carrier divisions vanished. Tens of thousands of sailors were dead. The Empire's capacity to project power across the Pacific ended forever. The decisive battle doctrine collapsed, not with triumph, but with smoke drifting across black water. For America, the victory confirmed the supremacy of industry and adaptation. For Japan, the defeat was humiliation beyond measure. The men who returned to shore carried scars that could never heal. Burns, blindness, memories of comrades screaming as steel turned molten around them. The aftermath was not just strategic, it was human. In villages across Japan, telegrams arrived by the thousands. Mothers wept. Fathers bowed in silence. Families clung to portraits of sons who had vanished into the Pacific. And still, the Empire told them it was honor. But honor could not raise the dead. Honor could not replace the ships rotting beneath the waves. Honor could not explain why 91% of carrier crews never came home. The Japanese carrier force had gambled everything on spirit, and spirit had been consumed. What remained was only ash, twisted steel, and a silence heavy enough to bury an empire's pride. In the ruins of 1945, the ocean itself seemed to hold the memory of Japan's carrier fleet. Beneath the waves lay Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shōkaku, Zuikaku, Taihō, Shinano, and so many more. Steel tombs scattered across the Pacific, each one a graveyard for hundreds, sometimes thousands of men. From 10 mighty fleet carriers at the start of the war, none remained. 91% of those who had served aboard them were dead. 25,000 sailors and aviators vanished into fire and salt water. The fleet that had once revolutionized naval warfare ended not as a weapon, but as a warning. The lesson was stark. Spirit alone could not overcome arithmetic. Courage could not outlast industry. Sacrifice, when chained to flawed doctrine, became futility. Japan had believed that willpower could compensate for weakness in material and training. Instead, willpower was consumed, burned away in the very fires it could not extinguish. For America and the world, the destruction of Japan's carriers marked a turning point in history. It proved that naval power no longer rested in battleships, but in aviation, in the ability to strike across horizons with relentless force. It confirmed that training, logistics, and adaptation, not merely bravery, would decide the wars of the modern age. And for Japan itself, the legacy was more complex, more painful. The carriers became symbols of national pride turned to ashes, monuments to the cost of hubris. Survivors spoke of comrades lost in firestorms, of seas burning with fuel, of the emptiness that followed. Their voices carried a message that generations after them would wrestle to understand, that blind faith in sacrifice can destroy more than it preserves. Today, the wrecks still lie silent in the deep. Divers descend into their dark halls, flashlights glinting off rusted steel. Fish swim through hangars where once Zero fighters waited to launch. Silence replaces the roar of engines, the cries of men, the thunder of bombs. The sea keeps its secrets, but the lesson lingers above the waves. The carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy did not simply lose a war. They showed how doctrine divorced from reality can devour an entire generation. They revealed that no matter how fierce the spirit, no fleet can escape the laws of numbers, of steel, of time. And so the final legacy of Japan's carrier arm is not victory, nor even defeat, but tragedy. A tragedy vast enough to fill an ocean,